A scientist in Belgium stares at a computer screen and refuses, for a moment, to believe what he's looking at. In front of him is a genetic sequence pulled from a small, dried, 200-year-old human heart, a heart that has been stolen, hidden, smuggled across borders, dropped, nearly lost forever, and finally sealed inside a crystal urn in a French cathedral. He runs the analysis again. Same result. He sends a portion of the sample to a laboratory in Germany, one that has no idea what the Belgian lab found, so there's no chance of bias creeping into the numbers. Weeks later, the German results come back. They match. 2 independent labs, 2 different countries, and one impossibly small, impossibly old piece of tissue had just answered a question that had haunted France for 2 centuries. What really happened to the boy who was supposed to be king? That boy's name was Louis Charles. He was born in 1785, the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette of France, and for the first few years of his life, he was simply a spare, a younger brother, a child who wasn't expected to inherit anything more than a minor title. Then his older brother died of tuberculosis in 1789, and suddenly this small, fair-haired boy became the Dauphin of France, heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, at the exact moment that throne was starting to collapse. Portraits from the period show a round-cheeked child dressed in miniature court clothing, and letters from his mother describe an ordinary, affectionate little boy who liked animals, gardens, and being read to. He had no idea that he had been born directly into the path of a revolution. When the French Revolution reached its most violent phase, the royal family was arrested and imprisoned in a fortress in Paris called the Temple. In 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. Later that year, Marie Antoinette was executed as well. Their son, only 8 years old, was left behind in the Temple prison, and what happened to him next is one of the darker chapters of that entire era. He was separated from his surviving sister, placed in the custody of a revolutionary shoemaker named Antoine Simon, and later locked away in near total isolation. Witnesses described a child who stopped speaking, stopped moving much, and was left in filthy conditions for extended stretches of time. Whether through deliberate cruelty, revolutionary indifference, or simple institutional neglect, the boy's health broke down completely. In June 1795, at 10 years old, he died in that cell. The official cause was recorded as tuberculosis, complicated by the effects of prolonged confinement and neglect. Almost immediately, people refused to accept that the story was over. France in the 1790s was a country in chaos, full of grief, propaganda, and desperate hope, and rumors began spreading that the child who died in the Temple wasn't really the prince at all, that loyal supporters had somehow smuggled the real boy out and left a substitute, a sick orphan, to die in his place. Once that rumor took hold, it never fully went away. Over the next 100 years, more than 40 different men across Europe and even in the United States stepped forward at various points claiming to be the lost Dauphin, all grown up under a hidden identity. The most famous of them was a German clockmaker named Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, who arrived in Paris in the 1830s insisting he was Louis Charles, produced supposed childhood memories and old scars as evidence, gathered a genuine following, and even convinced members of the royal household staff that he might be telling the truth. He died still claiming to be the prince, and his descendants continued making the same claim for generations afterward, some of them petitioning courts in France well into the 20th century to have the family name officially recognized as royal. For historians, the frustrating part was that there was no way to definitively settle any of it. Documents from the revolutionary period were incomplete or deliberately falsified. Witnesses were biased, dead, or unreliable. It became, essentially, an unsolvable historical argument, a case built entirely on competing stories with no neutral referee capable of separating fact from wishful thinking. And yet, sitting quietly through all of this, there was a physical piece of evidence that almost nobody thought could ever be useful, a preserved human heart. During the child's autopsy in 1795, the doctor performing the examination, Philippe Jean Pelletan, followed an old custom of the era, in which the hearts of royalty were sometimes removed and preserved separately from the body. Pelletan took the boy's heart, placed it in alcohol, and kept it. What happened to that heart afterward reads almost like fiction. It was reportedly stolen by one of Peloton's own students. It passed through the hands of several private collectors. It was nearly destroyed during a later period of civil unrest in Paris, when a mob broke into the home of the archbishop who had come to possess it and smashed the crystal urn it was kept in, scattering the contents. Remarkably, the dried heart was recovered from the wreckage. It changed hands several more times over the following decades, was authenticated and re-authenticated by different church and royal officials, and was eventually placed for safekeeping with the House of Bourbon Parma, a branch of the former French royal family living in exile. By the late 20th century, it had ended up back in France, kept as a relic, its authenticity still completely unproven by anything other than a chain of custody and a lot of tradition. For most of the 20th century, this whole case was treated as effectively unsolvable and interesting historical curiosity, but not something science could actually weigh in on. That changed with the rise of a specific kind of genetic testing, one built around a very unusual part of human biology called mitochondrial DNA. Almost all of the DNA that makes you who you are, your eye color, your height, thousands of traits, comes from a roughly even mix of both of your parents, shuffled together in a way that becomes harder and harder to trace cleanly the further back you go. But there's a small, separate loop of DNA that lives inside structures called mitochondria, the energy-producing components of your cells, and it behaves completely differently. You inherit your mitochondrial DNA exclusively from your mother. Your father's mitochondrial DNA does not get passed down at all. That means your mitochondrial DNA is essentially identical to your mother's, which is essentially identical to her mother's, stretching back in an unbroken maternal line for many generations, changing only very slowly through rare random mutations. A man cannot pass mitochondrial DNA to his children at all, only women can, only to their own children. Which means if you can trace a clean, unbroken line of mothers and daughters across time, you can compare genetic material from two people who lived centuries apart and know with very high confidence whether they share that same maternal line. This is exactly what made the case of the Lost Prince solvable. Marie Antoinette had a well-documented family tree. She was born Maria Antonia in Vienna, the daughter of the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa, and she had multiple sisters whose own descendants could, in theory, be traced forward through history along a purely maternal line. If researchers could locate living women today who were connected to Marie Antoinette through this same unbroken maternal chain, their mitochondrial DNA should match hers almost exactly. And if the heart preserved from the Temple prison really did belong to Marie Antoinette's son, its mitochondrial DNA should match those living relatives too, because a son inherits his mother's mitochondrial DNA even though he can't pass it on himself. In 1999, a Belgian geneticist named Jean-Jacques Cassamon took on the challenge of actually testing this.
It was not a simple task.
The heart tissue was roughly 2 centuries old, had been handled by dozens of people over the decades without any of the sterile precautions modern science would use, and had been exposed to open air, changing storage conditions, and general degradation the entire time. Ancient DNA of this kind tends to be badly fragmented, chemically damaged, and extremely difficult to extract reliably. On top of that, there was a serious risk of contamination. Any one of the countless people who had touched the heart over 200 years could have left behind trace amounts of their own DNA, which might get picked up by the testing equipment and mistaken for the actual sample. To guard against that risk, Cassamon didn't rely on a single laboratory. A portion of the sample was sent to his own lab in Belgium, and another portion was sent independently to a laboratory in Münster, Germany, run by a different research team using different equipment, without knowledge of what the Belgian side was finding. If both labs, working blind to each other, arrived at the same genetic sequence, that result would be extremely difficult to dismiss as an accident or an error. At the same time, researchers worked on the other half of the puzzle, locating living relatives who could be confidently traced back to Marie Antoinette's maternal line. They found 2 women who fit this description through documented, unbroken descent from Marie Antoinette's mother, Maria Theresa, and her sisters, women completely unrelated to each other in any recent sense, whose only real genetic connection to one another ran back through this same centuries-old maternal thread. Their cooperation gave scientists something to actually compare the heart's DNA against, rather than testing it in a vacuum. The extraction process itself took weeks. Ancient DNA work like this typically has a high failure rate, and everyone involved understood that a 200-year-old, well-traveled, repeatedly handled sample like this one might simply yield nothing usable at all. But slowly, fragment by fragment, both laboratories managed to reconstruct a readable portion of the mitochondrial sequence from the heart tissue. When they compared it against the two living descendants, the sequences matched. Both labs, working independently, reached the same conclusion. To further strengthen the case, researchers also compared the heart's DNA against preserved hair samples known to have belonged to Marie Antoinette herself and to two of her sisters, and those samples were consistent with the same maternal line as well. The results, published in 2000, were about as close to conclusive as historical genetics gets. The heart preserved from the Temple prison did belong to a child from Marie Antoinette's direct maternal line. Combined with the well-documented historical record of the autopsy, the chain of custody, and the fact that no other child from that specific maternal line was known to have died and been autopsied under those circumstances at that time and place, the scientific community and most historians accepted this as strong confirmation that the heart truly was that of Louis Charles, the boy who died in the Temple in 1795. In practical terms, this meant that Karl Wilhelm Naundorf and every other pretender who had claimed to be the escaped dauphin over the previous 2 centuries could not have been telling the truth, at least not in the sense of being the same child who was born to Marie Antoinette. The DNA didn't just fail to confirm their stories, it actively ruled them out, since none of their bloodlines matched the maternal signature preserved in the heart. For descendants of Naundorf and other claimants who had spent generations believing, or at least publicly insisting, that they carried royal blood, this was obviously a difficult result to accept, and some of them continued to dispute the findings afterward. But from a scientific standpoint, the case is about as settled as a 200-year-old mystery can be. The boy did not escape. He was not smuggled out by loyal servants. He lived a short, difficult, largely isolated final few years and died in that Paris prison exactly as the original 1795 records claimed, worn down by illness and the harsh conditions of his confinement. In June 2004, more than 200 years after his death, the heart of Louis Charles was finally given a proper burial. In a ceremony attended by several descendants of European royal families, it was placed in the Basilica of Saint Denis outside Paris, the traditional burial site of French monarchs, laid to rest near where his parents, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, are also buried. It was, in a very literal sense, a child finally being reunited with his family after 2 centuries spent as a relic passed between strangers, thieves, and collectors. What makes this case so striking isn't just that it solved a single historical argument, although it certainly did that. It's what the case demonstrates about the limits of memory, rumor, and even sincere belief when they aren't backed by physical evidence. For 200 years, this was a story kept alive by grief, by hope, and by people who genuinely wanted to believe that something terrible hadn't actually happened, that somehow, somewhere, the boy had gotten out. Dozens of men built entire identities, families, and legal battles around that hope, and some of their descendants carried that belief sincerely for generations, having no way to verify or disprove it themselves. It took a very specific, very unusual property of human biology, a piece of genetic material passed down cleanly from mother to child, untouched by fathers, untouched by marriage, impossible to forge or fake, to finally cut through all of that and give a definitive answer. It's also a reminder of how much modern science can do with fragments that seem, on the surface, hopelessly degraded and useless. A dried, 2-century-old piece of heart tissue, handled by countless hands, stored under terrible conditions, nearly destroyed more than once, still held enough intact genetic information to answer a question that had defeated historians, royal courts, and generations of investigators. Cases like this one have gone on to influence how historians and forensic scientists approach other unresolved royal and historical mysteries, using the same basic principle: find the maternal thread, find living descendants along that thread, and let the DNA do what documents and rumors never could. So the next time you come across an old, unresolved historical mystery, a disputed identity, a disappearance nobody could ever confirm, a rumor that persisted for generations without proof. It's worth remembering the case of Louis Charles. Sometimes the only witness that never lies, never forgets, and can never be bribed or fooled isn't a person at all. It's a molecule, quietly carried forward inside every one of us, waiting for someone with the right tools to finally ask it the right question.